one. And with that, I will go off camera and let you present. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. I want to thank Nathan and his colleagues at Vote Solar, as well as a number of the other organizations that have come together to provide me the platform this afternoon. I'm looking forward to spending the next 90 minutes with you all, giving kind of what we refer to as a PURA 101. You know, I say this often, and I'm going to continue saying it. I think PURA is one of the least understood, and as a result, least utilized state agencies that there are. And I don't think that that's a Connecticut specific problem. You know, having worked at the equivalent agency in Maryland for a number of years, I think regulatory commissions, which are sometimes referred to as public service commissions or public utility commissions, it's a really wonky field, and it's yields a regulatory agency that's difficult to understand. We don't function like any other state agency, yet we have jurisdiction over a number of different fields and sectors that are really becoming essential to your daily life. So we put together a PURA 101 presentation, hopefully to help provide a entree into our regulatory agency, to give you an idea about what we regulate, what we don't regulate, and most importantly, in my opinion, some tools to help you engage in PURA proceedings. I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you'll understand why it's so critical to not just you and your families, you know, relationship with the energy, water, telecom utilities in Connecticut, but engagement from, you know, individual ratepayers or businesses can really truly affect the outcome of PURA proceedings. So I am going to share my screen and walk through. I just have, you know, a handful of slides and some additional slides for backup if it's called for by some questions. I understand that there's a Q&A option. Feel free to put in your questions that are sparked throughout the presentation. We may pause after sections to see if there's any questions, but if not, there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So again, thanks for having me, and let's get right into it. So, okay, so I talked a little bit about our agenda and the appendices that are available. We can get into with questions and answers, but I'd like to start with talking a little bit more in detail about who PURA is. And I thought the best way to do that is really to start with our mission statement, which is up on the screen. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I want to bring a few things to your attention. PURA, as the regulatory body in Connecticut, we have jurisdiction over the electric utilities, the gas utilities, some of the water utilities. The key differentiator here and how you can tell who we regulate and who we don't is whether the utility is what's called an investor-owned utility. So these are privately held corporations. So in terms of an example, we do regulate Eversource, we do regulate UI, we do not regulate, for example, Norwich, or if you are, you know, a water customer in the Hartford area, we do not regulate MDC. So the differentiation there is between utilities that are privately owned versus those that are publicly owned, usually by a municipality. So the reason that we regulate them, and what this about us is showing you on the screen, is, you know, historically utilities that are a monopoly are regulated, and the reason that they are allowed to be a monopoly, you know, traces back hundreds of years at this point, and it's because when electricity, that's the easiest example here, when electricity really started, you know, getting going and things became more electrified, folks quickly realized, both for safety reasons as well as economies of scale, it's just not practical or cost, you know, it is cost prohibitive to have multiple utilities serving the same customer using their different distribution infrastructure. So the way to think about this is, if you look out the window and you see poles and wires, In order for you to be served, if you're an Eversource customer, in order to be served, by someone other than Eversource, you might need to have 10 sets of poles and wires. It really becomes, quickly becomes not a calculus that the world was willing to engage in. So they created the legislature created bodies in every state and jurisdiction like PURA, where they essentially ceded, rate making authority to a state agency. And so the theory here is that regulatory agencies like PURA can step in and provide what the market otherwise would, and that being a check on the prices that are charged by these utilities. So that's a long-winded way of showing or of explaining what is on the screen right now, is that PURA, we're there to balance the interests between these regulated utilities and the public at large. Now, one thing that you may have noticed was, hugely absent from the explanation I just gave you, was something that I often hear, in the news or on the floor of the legislature, folks referring to PURA as the watchdog. And rightly or wrongly, that is not in PURA's mission statement. We're not a watchdog per se in the way that you may commonly think of this. There's a separate entity in the regulatory space known as the Office of Consumer Counsel, or the OCC for short, which is another state agency that has a statutory right to intervene in any PURA proceeding and represent the interests of the ratepayer in all of our proceedings. Now, that's not to say that PURA shouldn't or couldn't be a watchdog. Rather, it's to draw your attention to the fact that that's not currently in our mission statement. We're instead tasked with something that's more nebulous, which is balancing the interests. For me, this has been, frankly, a struggle. I've been here about 2.5 years, and I think different chairs, different commissioners would approach this differently. I would love to work on refining the mission statement of PURA, both to address this kind of question about accountability and risk shifting, but also to, get more into the weeds on the types of considerations that PURA should be adopting into our dockets. So by that, I mean, more explicitly about whether we should be considering impacts from climate change or, societal impacts on programs and things that we're tasked with reviewing. So sometimes when I talk about what PURA does or does regulate, the easiest way to explain it is often in the negative. And by that, I mean talking about activities that we do not regulate. Because when I say broadly that we regulate things like electric, gas, water, telecommunications, everything that falls underneath of there, you would think was fair game. But because PURA is a creature of statute, meaning that we derive all of our authority from laws that are adopted by the legislature, unless we've been, kind of extended specific jurisdiction over an item, it's not something that we proactively are authorized to regulate. So some examples of things that we don't regulate, the ones that we most commonly, get questions about are the ones in yellow at the top of the screen. So I'd say in any given week, probably 40% of the calls that come into our customer call center are questions about your cable company or your internet company. And, unfortunately, while we still maintain regulatory relationships with those companies, about 2 decades ago, the legislature, decided to, and this was in conjunction with some federal rules at the time, it's actually the federal body, the FCC, who exercises more jurisdiction over those companies. When it comes to things like the prices and the terms, of programs and plans that you may get from your cable or internet company, those are outside of state jurisdiction. So we do exercise some jurisdiction, like over things like service quality or access to public access channels. But generally speaking, prices in terms of internet and cable, we don't have jurisdiction over. Similar, the same goes for cell phones. So to bring it back around to what we do regulate under those broad umbrellas of electric, gas, water, and some telecom. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but these are some of the things that you may in your day-to-day, either personal life or overlap with your interests or your business. These are some of the things that we most commonly do interact with. What you may be obviously the most familiar with are the distribution rates that your electric and gas utility can charge. And those are things that are set through what is referred to as a rate case. Now, we can get more into this through the remainder of the presentation, but I want to pause for a moment and put a fine point on the word distribution. And this is hearkening back to the example I gave at the beginning as to why the utilities are monopoly creatures. They're monopolies when it comes to their distribution infrastructure. And by that, I mean the poles and wires, whether they're overhead or underground, that take the electricity from point A to your house or your business. That's literally the infrastructure that's distributing the commodity of energy. The distribution portion of your bill is still fully regulated because there is only one entity in your service territory that provides it. The distribution rates are not the only thing on your bill. If you've ever taken, the time to look at the bill, the bills in Connecticut, and this was, a surprise to me coming here 2 years ago for this position. The bills for the electric companies, seem to be an odd mismatch of too much information and not enough at the same time. So that is something that we and our stakeholders are acutely aware of. If you'd like to understand more about what your electric bill says or doesn't say today, we've made 2 YouTube videos that are available on PURA's website and our YouTube channel that take you step by step through the electric bills as they stand today. So that is something that we do regulate. There are other things on here, vegetation management, which is a fancy word for tree cutting. That is another thing that we regulate, at least as it pertains to the distribution infrastructure. On the water side, we have similar jurisdiction as to what I was just talking about with the electric and gas companies. We can set rates. We also do, there are a lot of small water companies in the state of Connecticut, some as small as, a dozen customers. More and more, we're seeing the larger water companies purchase those, small water companies, and that's something that we have jurisdiction over as well. Okay, so here's another thing that makes PURA different from other state agencies, and it's that PURA is led by 3 commissioners. If you are familiar with other state agencies, they're typically headed by either a commissioner or a secretary, the point being that they're typically headed by one agency head. And the reason I'm bringing this to your attention and showing you the pictures of my 2 colleagues here is because it's one of the first ways that I can demonstrably illustrate to you how PURA is different and why that's important. And the reason that we have 3 agency heads is because over the matters that we exercise jurisdiction, like the ones I was just talking about on the prior screen, PURA exercises our jurisdiction comparable to a court. So say that a different way. We are a quasi-judicial agency. So the best analogy is really to the court system. When you look at the 3 pictures on the screen, we act similar to a judge, to each of us as a judge. So any decisions that we make have to be approved by a majority of the commissioners. We each get equal votes. So there's 3 of us. So for something to be adopted, it has to receive 2 of 3 votes. I'm going to get into a little bit more about what else a quasi-judicial agency, how else that impacts how you interact with us in just a moment. But for now, the important takeaway from this slide is it's not just me. There are 2 other commissioners, and we have an equal vote when things come up for a decision. Okay, so a little bit more about what it means when I say quasi-judicial. And there are a lot of layers to this, and I'm going to try to touch on the ones that are the most impactful to understanding how PURA does what we do. So I'll start with the second bullet first, actually. And want to briefly go back to primer on the difference between statutes, regulations, and decisions, and how this interacts with the work that we do. So as I mentioned earlier, PURA is a creature of statute, meaning all the authority that we have is delegated to us by the legislature. So if something's in statute, it doesn't matter what a commission, what a PURA regulation says, or even what a PURA decision says. The statute is the primary, method of binding someone. So sometimes statutes require some additional elaboration in terms of the level of detail. Those can be turned over to PURA to pass regulations, which can attempt to interpret or elaborate on the statutes that were passed, but they cannot contradict the statute. And then finally, there's decisions, and PURA issues, hundreds of decisions a year. And the decisions look comparable to a court opinion. So, if you are thinking, if you're the generation that was really involved in Law and Order, or even back to Perry Mason, and you're thinking about a courtroom, let me draw your attention to that analogy to further explain how PURA works. So all of our material, everything that we're tasked with, is done through a docketed proceeding. You can also call it a case. So we have parties that appear before us. We have witnesses. We have, the parties are represented by attorneys in most cases. If you're thinking to the Law and Order analogy, remember the commissioners, there's 3 of us, we're sitting for the case just like a judge would, except there's 3 of us. Then we have parties that are appearing before us. We have some statutory parties, which means that by statute, we have to recognize them in our proceeding. That includes the Office of Consumer Counsel that we talked about earlier, as well as some other state agencies, most notably DEEP, which is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And then we also include as parties any of the regulated entities that would be affected by our decisions. So in that case, most notably Eversource, UI, or their gas or water affiliates. Through this investigation or the proceeding, we can interpret the statutes and interpret the regulations, and then we can reach a decision. And that decision has to be based on evidence that is gathered throughout that proceeding, and only that evidence. That results in a binding decision that, when I say binding, I mean legally binding on the entities that we regulate. The decision can be appealed to Superior Court, but otherwise that decision is binding on the parties. So another analogy to the Law and Order space, if you ever remember some of the scenes where the judge pulls somebody back into their office, I remember seeing that it's always the attorney it's always the prosecutor and the defense attorney. And you may remember them talking about something called ex parte. those rules apply to all PURA proceedings. So ex parte rules mean, and they're put in place to protect, the interests not just of the parties we regulate, but of ratepayers and everyone else who'd be affected by a decision as well. So ex parte means that decision maker, so in this case, myself and my fellow commissioners or our staff, we cannot discuss or speculate about how a decision is going to turn out unless we're in a hearing room where all the parties to the matter had the opportunity to be heard. So this means that there are no closed door meetings with UI or Eversource or Aquarion or Connecticut Water. We're not behind closed doors talking to them about what we should do or how we should do it, because that would be a violation of the ex parte rules. And by the same token, that means that I can't talk to a ratepayer like on a proceeding like this. If I get any questions about like, well, how are you going to decide, such and such matter? I can't tell you. Because that would be a violation of the ex parte rules and would, violate the due process rights of other parties to that case. So some of the other things, I think I've touched on most of the other bullets on this screen, with the exception of the docket numbers, and this will become more important in a couple slides from now. But as I mentioned, all of PURA's business is done through what is referred to as a docket. Or a case or something, and each docket is assigned a specific number. And even if you've interacted with PURA before, this may be news to you. There is a rhyme and reason to how we assign docket numbers. The first two digits refer to the year in which the matter was opened, followed by the month, and then the number that docket is that month. So for example, if it's the 11th item filed with us in the month of January 2022, the docket number would be 2022-01-11. So that's the logic behind how we assign docket numbers, and they're incredibly important, they're incredibly important to know and have a reference to, because PURA maintains an active docket roster of on average 100 cases a year, and that's not counting all the renewable generator certifications that we do. So it's a lot to keep track of, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to how to keep track of that on the balance of the presentation. But the docket numbers is a key thing to know in terms of engaging with PURA. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit more about our organizational structure, and then also why that's important to you if you're a ratepayer or an advocacy organization and that may be tuning in. In total, PURA has about 85 staff, including the commissioners and all of our administrative support. I don't know if that's smaller or bigger than what you were expecting, but it is what it is. We have 85 staff to regulate all of the different sectors that we're tasked with. And we have them split up between 6 offices. And the one that I want to call the most attention to is an office that I created July of 2020. That didn't exist, before that. The remaining offices that are shown on the screen, these are part of what we refer to as decisional staff. So when it comes to the ex parte rules that I was talking about a minute ago, it doesn't matter if you're talking to one of my staff or if you're talking to me, we're still bound by those same ex parte rules. And that can be really limiting and challenging, especially if you are a stakeholder that doesn't frequently interact with PURA. You don't know who you can talk to, you don't know where to go. And I think that that's been a real barrier to participation in some of our proceedings. So we created this office, the Office of Education, Outreach, and Enforcement, the middle one here. We sometimes refer to it as EOE for short. The reason I'm calling that to your attention is because they are a division of PURA that is not bound by ex parte rules. So they are, essentially walled off from PURA decisional staff, and they act similar to a party in our proceedings. So we have some specific items that we will delegate to them, but most importantly, they're there as a resource for especially what I refer to as our non-traditional stakeholders. So entities that, whether you're an individual or, an advocacy organization that doesn't frequently interact with PURA, EOE is created so that they can help explain our rules and process to you. They also sometimes lead working groups or mediation or other types of alternative dispute resolution on behalf of PURA. Importantly, they can't speak on behalf of PURA, so they're not providing an answer that's legally binding, but they are staff that have worked, with other members of PURA, been trained by me, by PURA, so they know how we work, how we operate, and it can help, smooth things out either from, an application point of view, whether you are trying to get a renewable generator certified and online, whether you're trying to get a sub-metering application through. So they can help with things like that. They can also help with individual customer bill questions. We have a call center. So really, EOE, if you are brand new to engaging with PURA, and you walk away from this presentation with a little bit of information, but you want more, that's okay. We have a whole division of staff that are tasked with, helping to facilitate that interaction. They can't serve as your legal counsel, but again, they can help provide some tips and tricks. Okay, so before I get into how to engage with PURA, I see a number of Q&A and chats coming in. Nathan, do you want to let me know if any of those are things that we should cover now before we go any further?
Sure, that sounds great. Before we get started to some of these questions, I want to ask one question which will hopefully provide a little bit of insight here. So there's something that I think may be a little counterintuitive. So PURA is the Public Utility Regulatory Authority. Obviously, public utility is right in the name there, but PURA is regulating utilities that are privately owned. So, and PURA is not regulating utilities that are publicly owned, such as municipal utilities. Can you help explain that or provide a little bit more context to why that is?
Yeah, I can certainly try. So as I mentioned, every state, every jurisdiction, even internationally, other countries have equivalents to PURA. They're often called public utility commissions or public service commissions. And, I can't speak on behalf of the entire industry, but my guess is that, 100 plus years ago, when the idea of regulation came about, is grounded in the belief that the things that we're regulating are public goods. So access to electricity, access to water, access to gas, these are essential services that the public has an interest in receiving in an affordable and reliable manner. So they created regulatory bodies that were tasked with regulating these as public utilities. So we're trying to regulate them in a way where they're more akin to a publicly owned utility. But as you mentioned, these are not publicly owned utilities. In fact, they're investor-owned utilities, which I think is really interesting. So but before I worked here, worked for a trade association and had a board of directors, and you have to go through extensive training about fiduciary duties and who your responsibility is to. And when you have an investor-owned utility, these are essentially set up as corporations with fiduciary duties to stakeholders. So the reason you have regulators is because the idea of a regulator is that you're coming in and making sure that the interests of all the stakeholders involved are essentially balanced, and you're trying to deliver what the market would otherwise provide in a competitive setting. So I know it sounds counterintuitive. We are not regulating public utilities because the thought process there is, that they do not have a profit motive. They are being run for, the good of their citizens, and that they don't need the oversight. But we are regulating investor-owned utilities. So I hope that touched on that.
Thank you. And actually, you had a great segue to the next question, which was, what authority does PURA have over Eversources, and I'll just broaden that to say any of the investor-owned utilities, actions as a private corporation responsible to its shareholders?
Great question. So let me try to break this down. Eversource, and this is not unique to Eversource, UI is in a similar place. A lot of the utilities in today's age are both multi-jurisdictional and operate across multiple sectors. So by that, I mean, like, Eversource operates affiliates in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, UI does in Maine and New York. Both of those companies have both electric and gas affiliates, and Eversource also has a water one. So obviously, or maybe this isn't obvious, I only can exercise jurisdiction over the company's efforts within Connecticut. So when it comes to something that they're doing in Massachusetts or New Hampshire, or with their unregulated offshore wind company, Orsted, those are outside of the jurisdiction that the legislature, the state legislature, can empower, PURA to look at, because we're also limited by, things like the Federal Power Act. So there's a lot of different layers of legislation and statutes here, but we are restricted to looking at things that they are doing within the state of Connecticut that are affecting Connecticut ratepayers. So a concrete example of this is, we often hear frustration about salaries of the executives of these utilities, and how much of that is being reflected in rates. And I cannot reach upwards and prohibit a corporation from paying its executive X number of dollars. I can regulate how much of that is recovered through Connecticut rates, but because they have unregulated businesses, because they have businesses in other states, I cannot reach upwards into a larger corporation and say, you shall not pay your CEO more than X, $1 million. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much. So we have actually a couple questions in regard to vegetation management, and I'll try to ask both at the same time. So presumably, well, you mentioned earlier that PURA has oversight over vegetation management, and sometimes that doesn't necessarily align with what would be the public's interest. So, and vegetation management does have an impact on climate change. If pesticides are being used, that has an impact on the environment. So how do you actually align the interest of Eversource with the interest of the public, which Eversource is serving, in regard to vegetation management?
That's a great question. I'll try to answer it broadly, because we definitely have a couple of pending dockets before PURA in terms of folks that are appealing tree warden decisions on trees in the state. So from a broad perspective, vegetation management actually can be used as a metaphor for just about everything that we regulate. There are clearly lots of competing interests. Vegetation management, when done properly, can prevent hazard trees from falling on infrastructure and causing cascading power outages during a weather event. And obviously the public has an interest in having their lights stay on, as well as not having to pay for replacement infrastructure. So that's one, what I would say. I'll use the word narrow for a second and say that's one, narrow viewpoint. There are clearly others, and increasingly we see folks that are interested in the environmental impact from vegetation management. And whether that's an environmental impact from the loss of the trees or from the use of the pesticides before and after to manage the, the vegetation that comes in after that. There are lots of different interests that I would say have not been historically represented, and not just PURA dockets, but I'd say, nationwide. And this will kind of circle back to my opening statement about the mission statement of PURA. PURA and our sister agencies in other states, we've historically been thought of as economic regulators, meaning that we constrain our evaluation to the numbers and cents. But if you've heard me, kind of get on my soapbox on vegetation management and other settings, you'll hear me say, okay, it's a very narrow viewpoint to say, well, is it cheaper to cut down the trees for this, stretch of the circuit? And then is it cheaper to rebuild that pole and wire every time a storm comes through? Sure, it may be. But vegetation management has to be done. It's not just a one and done. It has to be done frequently, like every 4 years. It's extremely costly. And it's also costly to restring a pole and wire after every storm if you're having more and more storms. So what we're hoping to do through some of the dockets at PURA is start broadening our perspective and say, okay, we've had the same set of stakeholders for however many decades that there have been, and we haven't considered all these other cost, externalities. It's time to start folding that into the way that we do business. And that's kind of what the presentation here today is designed to do. It's designed to let people know that those interests are not necessarily represented in our proceedings. If you feel that they should be, we're striving to give you the tools to understand how you might present those different viewpoints. So let me stop there and see if I've answered the question.
I think that's a great overview. Thank you. So we have a couple jurisdictional questions. The first is, do you approve or disapprove independent grids / microgrids?
I may need some clarification on this, but if the question is about, there is a microgrid program in the state that provides some incentives, and that's actually administered by our sister agency, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Where PURA comes in is if there's a question about how that microgrid interfaces with the rest of the grid, like so interconnecting, if it has to cross a public right of way. So it's not that we don't get involved, but I'd say that if the question is from the perspective of do we administer the program that incentivizes microgrids, the answer to that's no. That's run through DEEP and specifically BETP.
I think that covers it. Great, thank you. And why doesn't PURA regulate wastewater treatment? I don't know if you can answer that succinctly or not.
Yeah, great question. The short answer is because the legislature hasn't asked us to or told us to. Wastewater treatment is there is some jurisdiction from overlapping jurisdiction from the Department of Public Health and DEEP, again, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. It's not, so just because I say PURA is not regulating it doesn't mean that the state's not. I can't speak definitively to their jurisdiction, but I know that they have some. So we do, we do keep track of how wastewater treatment facilities are impacted by the loss of commercial power, meaning like when the grid goes down during a weather event, but we're not directly regulating regulating it from the perspective of setting standards or things like that.
So I'm going to ask one more question. There's a few other questions I'm going to hold to later in the presentation. But one question is, can you help explain a little bit better? And I know you have a whole presentation on this on YouTube, but can you explain the distribution portion of a customer's bill a little bit better? So for instance, if they are buying renewable energy 100%, how does that impact their distribution portion of their bill? Or can you just in general outline the components of the distribution on the bill?
Yeah, I absolutely can try, and I would we'll drop. Oops, let me go. Oh no, I did. Okay. Okay, I was looking to go back to my screen so I could drop the two YouTubes directly into the chat. Hopefully I did that successfully. So I will encourage folks to visit those links. There's one for Eversource and one for UI. They're about, I don't know, 10 minutes a piece, but I'll try to give a brief overview now. And if you are thinking about your electric bill as it stands today, and I keep emphasizing as it stands today, because one of the things that PURA is working on and very close to completing actually is a redesign of the customer's electric bills to bring some additional transparency and clarity to what's going on here. But if you're thinking about it as it exists today, you'll likely be familiar with how the bills are split into two components generally, the supply and the delivery. And one of the most frequent questions that I get, or social media posts that I see, are like, why is my delivery portion of my bill 3 times my supply? How could it possibly cost 3 times what it does to supply my energy as to deliver it? And the short answer is it doesn't. What has been kind of lumped into that delivery fee over the years are many other components of what it takes to provide electricity to an end use customer. The supply is very clear, right? That is what you're paying for the commodity, whether you are shopping for a third-party supplier, like a 100% renewable tariff, for example, or if you're just on what's called standard service, meaning you've never shopped for your electricity and you're just receiving service from Eversource or UI, who, by the way, are procuring that on a pass-through basis, but that's an aside. The other roughly 70% of your bill that's lumped under delivery, I'd say only about like a third of your overall bill is really distribution, true distribution. And that refers to, again, the poles and wires. Another large percentage of your bill is going to transmission, which is regulated by the federal equivalent of PURA. So if you're looking for another bad analogy, like if you're thinking about the highway system and you're trying to get across states, like that's like your transmission network. Like it's high voltage, it's traveling long distances, that costs money, a lot of it. And it can be upwards of 20% of your bill. That is regulated by the FERC, which is the federal equivalent of PURA. And then the remainder of your bill, which can be 15 to 20%, depending on the month, is what's more broadly public policy. So this is not a commentary on whether this is right or wrong. I'm just offering to you that that a lot of the public policies that the legislature has adopted are funded through your electric bills. And it can be anything from like energy efficiency to, like the Millstone contract. Offshore wind will flow through that. So I know it sounds, again, counterintuitive because you think, well, offshore wind, Millstone, nuclear, like that is supply. Well, the way that the contracts are set up, they're more like price hedges. And I know I'm opening a whole nother can of worms, so I'm going to stop there. But it's showing up on the delivery side of your bill and not the supply. So that gets, there's a lot more detail on that in those YouTube links. I'd really encourage you to view those for some additional detail as well as information about who regulates each portion of the bill.
Great, thank you. So there are some more questions, but I'm going to hold them to allow you to get back to the rest of your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So let me pick up that. Nope, it did not pick up where I left off. Sorry, I knew I was going to do that. One moment here. Current slide, here we go. Okay, so to pick up where we left off, now hopefully you understand a little bit about what we do or don't regulate. And if not, I'm happy to explain that further. But what I want to do now is focus on how you can engage with PURA. Because what we've covered so far is that PURA has jurisdiction over a lot of things that affect your daily life. Number two, PURA can only make decisions based on the evidence that are put before us in our dockets, meaning that it doesn't matter if I, have an opinion one way or another, unless that information is presented to me in the docket, it doesn't serve the, as evidence on which I can base a decision. So that's why it's critically important to engage with PURA. So now I'm going to cover, there's kind of a spectrum of ways that you can engage with PURA. I'm going to start from the one end, and I'll end up with the most active ways to engage. So, the first thing that you can do is you can monitor our online calendar. And even better, you can sign up for email alerts. And happy to make this presentation available because I'm sure you can't click on my screen as I'm here, but these are all hyperlinked, with information, including tips and tricks on how to make that work for you. So as I mentioned, there's upwards of 100 active dockets at a time. So, monitoring what's going on at PURA can be a full-time job. In fact, many of the utilities engage people whose full-time job it is to monitor our dockets. But hopefully the automated email alert system helps you pick or at least narrow down what you're interested in following. If you've got that under control and you know that you want to offer a comment or a perspective on something that PURA is considering, we have two options. You can either provide oral comments, so you can show up to a public hearing that we put on, or you can submit those comments in writing. And really want to emphasize here that this is a choosing between providing the comments verbally or in writing is a personal preference. And by that, I mean that PURA gives equal weight to comments that are received in writing versus those that are received, verbally at a hearing. So if you can't make it in person to a hearing, but you want to be heard on the matter, please don't hesitate to put those comments into writing. I guarantee that we read them, and I'm going to show you evidence of the fact that we read them in just a couple of slides. If you know me or you've heard anything about me, I have 5-year-old twins, which means I don't sleep. So I guarantee you that any comments that you submit into the record are going to be read, if not by me directly, certainly by one of my staff, and they can make a huge difference. So if you're providing those comments into the record, especially if you're doing it in writing, one of the challenges that PURA has, and again, I don't think this is unique to PURA, I think this is something that regulatory commissions across the country struggle with, is as we've tried to become, increasingly accessible through, digital electronic means, our online systems haven't always kept up. Our filing system, and I'm going to show you some snapshots of that in a second, is older than I am. So, you know, it's difficult to navigate our system, but we're trying to make this more accessible to individual stakeholders, especially if you're just looking to file comments, you know, in a docket. And those can be provided by simply emailing them to the address on the screen, and preferably referencing the docket number in the subject line. If you do not know the docket number, but you know that PURA is actively considering a matter, you are always welcome to describe it in the subject line, or to ask, you know, through that email for assistance in locating the docket number. Lastly, the most, I'd say, intense yet rewarding way to interact with PURA is to formally intervene in a docket. This does often requires retaining, you know, an attorney to help you represent you in the docket. Remember that PURA is, as we spend some time talking about, a quasi-judicial agency. So there are just certain things that can be perceived as barriers that are requirements of the statutes that we just have to be mindful of here. And that's really because what we're regulating, you know, affects so many people so deeply that there are a lot of due process rights attached to these things. So if you're going to formally intervene in a docketed matter, and often requires retaining an attorney, that conveys to you a whole host of additional participation rights in our proceedings. Your attorney can, if you've been approved as an intervener, they can cross-examine witnesses put on by the other parties in the case. So if we're thinking about a rate case here, UI puts an expert on the stand, Eversource puts an expert on the stand, your attorney can cross-examine them based on the evidence that they're providing. Your attorney could also file a legal brief. So after hearings are concluded and you're trying to summarize the arguments in the case and really convince the commissioners of your position, that's where a brief comes in, and your attorney can do that. They can also help you provide comments on draft decisions that are issued by PURA. So in summary, there's work and cost and time involved in intervening in a docketed matter, but it conveys a lot of additional rights to participating in the docket. And I'd like to spend some time now showing you both what this kind of looks like, and then giving you some specific examples of how both filing written comments as well as taking the step to formally intervene in a matter, how those things can actually have real demonstrable impacts on the decisions that PURA makes. So forgive my kind of rudimentary screenshots here, but you know, I've given this presentation a couple of times and walked away thinking, you know, telling someone that Lotus, which is our filing system, is older than I am doesn't have the same impact as actually seeing a screenshot of what that looks like. So in the upper left-hand corner, this is a screenshot of one of the pages on our website. If you log on to the PURA website and you can locate the dockets page, it will look something like this. You can look up the active dockets. Once you get to once you click through that, you're going to get a page that looks like this. And I would recommend, if you think you're going to be and I hope you will be, a frequent contributor to PURA dockets, I would recommend bookmarking this page. So it gives you this box in the middle where, if you know your docket number and plug it in here, it will yield a screen that looks like, oops, super sensitive there, that looks like this. So on a flag, recognizing how challenging this organizational structure is, but it was worth spending a few minutes on. If you've gone to the PURA page before and thought, okay, well, I made it this far, I know my docket number, and I pulled this up, and you still are like scratching your head, like, what is that? I'm gonna try to explain it now. There are different types of filings that can be made in a docket. And the docket screenshot here is shown in alphabetical order. So like there, in this screenshot, if you're, my eyes are, I should have done this on separate screens, but it's showing that it starts with briefs and then it goes to compliance filings. If you flip to the next page, you'll see correspondence. You'll see something called interrogatories, which is a formal name for discovery questions that have been propounded on stakeholders in the proceeding. You'll see any decisions that have been issued. You'll see motions that parties have made, as well as if PURA has ruled on those. You'll see lots of pages of notices, whether they're notices of hearing or notice of request for written comments. The long and short of it is that if you're ever wondering how this is organized, it's alphabetically. At the start of a docket, you may not have seen it populated with as many things because briefs or motions, those don't happen until later in a case. But once all those filings and different types of filings start coming in, they'll show up alphabetically by type of document. Another really important thing that you can click on every time you access a docket, this arrow is pointing to something that says TS external, and it pops up a screen that you'll see in the lower right-hand corner that shows up green. And I know you can't read this, but you can try it at home. PURA is really attempting to publish what is referred to as an external calendar for as many dockets as we possibly can. And what the external calendar is meant to show is all the steps that we intend to take in the docket, as well as the, like, if it's a hearing, it will show the Zoom link, the date and time, and often we're trying to provide you insight into when we're going to finally adopt the decision as well. So these can be great tools if you're trying to monitor the progress of a docket. So as promised, I wanted to provide an example of, now I've talked to you about how you would engage with PURA and all the way up to like the formal intervention in a PURA process. And you may be thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of time and effort. Am I even sure that PURA is listening? And what I'd like to offer is that, over the past 2 years that I've been in this position, I'd like to think that we've made, an effort not only to make us more accessible, but also to show that we are listening. And we're trying to do that by reflecting what we've heard and read in these proceedings and explain how that has led us to a decision that's been made in a docket. And the one that I can most readily point to, probably because and also because it's so impactful to so many folks, was the investigation that we did into Eversource and UI's response to Tropical Storm Isaias. And it was the order itself was dozens and dozens of pages. So I've just pulled out 2 small snapshots to show you that there are sections in this document that reflect all the public comment that we heard. And then there's a section called Experience of the Municipalities. And I want to hold this up as an example of how impactful it can be if you intervene in a PURA proceeding. So in this case, several of the municipalities came together and retained a lawyer to represent multiple municipalities. And what that meant was that the first selectman of those municipalities could appear as witnesses in our proceeding, which meant that we could cross-examine them, take that as evidence in our proceeding. So the combination of the public as well as the evidence that was provided from what I would refer to as a non-traditional stakeholder, that being the municipalities, led to what I think was a hugely impactful decision in which PURA, at least in Eversource's case, decided to levy the maximum civil penalty that was permitted by law at the time, $28.4 million. So that is hopefully a telling example. It's just one of many. We have, I'm sure there are representatives from organizations on the presentation today whom I could provide similar examples of, including we just launched our energy storage solutions program, which is part of the Equitable Modern Grid Initiative that launched on January 1st of this year. And there are many stakeholder organizations that were instrumental to shaping the design and conclusion of that program. So lots of examples of meaningful contributions from stakeholders that haven't historically participated in PURA proceedings. Oops. Okay. Another thing that I thought was worth pointing out here, because this happens, this is a document that is issued in every single decision, and is one that you should keep an eye out for if you're trying to figure out where we're going in a docket. This is a screenshot of the version that was issued in that Storm Isaias investigation, but every docket at the start of a docket will receive what is called a notice of proceeding. And that's a legal document that announces a couple of things up front which are impactful. It will tell you the statutes and sometimes the regulations or the commission decisions on which PURA is basing its investigation. So you can all the statutes are accessible online. So in this case, we had cited statutes that gave us PURA the authority to to look into the storm response efforts of the utilities. It gave 1641 as our penalty statute. There's some rate making statutes thrown in here. So that's always an interesting thing to look at up front. It will also, it will also give you some information about the initial scope and what we're looking to do in that docket. Later on in the document, I'll scroll down, it will tell you who the parties and participants are in the proceeding. And if you are not on that list and you want to be, then it will explain the deadline by which you need to file for intervention in the matter. So the notice of proceeding is a document we file in every single case. They're always publicly available. They're obviously a little wonky, a little legalese, but they will provide some crucial information up front. Okay, and then I did want to flag and provide information on PURA's call center. The call center, and I will distinguish this from EOE more broadly and from PURA more broadly. The call center is really intended to help resolve individual concerns. So if you need help negotiating a payment arrangement, if you think that there is something wrong on your bill, if you have a question, but it's more specific to the individual, then we have folks in our call center that can assist with that. You can either file a complaint via this electronic form, you can email this address, or you can call. And the reason I'm putting so much emphasis on this being an individual concern is that if you are looking to make a recommendation or make a request of PURA that is more like policy oriented or require some formal action by PURA, that's kind of a broad strokes investigation, that's not the purpose of the call center. Rather, again, the call center is more targeted to assist with individual customer needs. Okay, and then I did want to spend a minute on just 2 or 3 minutes on these last 2 slides I think I have to provide some additional context as to why, if you haven't been involved in PURA proceedings historically, why you may want to be involved in them moving forward. Okay, so as folks may recall, and we've talked about Tropical Storm Isaias a little bit already, there was a special legislative session in 2020, and the legislature adopted on a bipartisan basis what's colloquially referred to as the Take Back the Grid Act. And there are a number, it's a fairly comprehensive bill that covers a lot of different provisions. There are some really interesting ones in there that will kind of lay the foundation for shaping years of energy policy to come. And specifically, one of the most impactful is something called performance-based regulation, or PBR for short. And you may have heard about it in the news, both either specific to Connecticut, or there's a handful of states investigating it, across the country. The United Kingdom uses a version of this. But basically, performance-based regulation is a totally different way of regulating utilities, where historically they're regulated through a frame of reference called cost of service regulation. And PBR is more oriented towards driving to specific results and incentivizing or penalizing a utility based on its achievement of some specific goals and metrics. So there's really a wholesale change to the way that Connecticut would regulate its utilities moving forward. And the legislation required PURA to launch this docket by January 1st of, it required us to launch the docket by, I think it was June 1st of 2021, which we did. And it is just getting underway. It will be a multi-year effort, but there's lots of room for, stakeholder contributions to helping us identify the metrics and objectives that we should be building this new regulatory construct on. So that is just getting underway. There are also some other aspects of the legislation that were impactful. PURA is looking at minimum staffing levels for the EDCs, this is, in addition to that, it ordered us to do some things like undertake a proceeding to do some interim rate decreases for Eversource and UI. Those were some dockets last year that occurred. It also increased some of the accountability measures that PURA can use. So it increased the amount that we can fine the utilities after an emergency event. And we're also now empowered to direct civil penalties to an energy assistance organization like Operation Fuel, where previously the money went into the general fund. So I have a whole host of appendices that get more into some of the other work that we're doing on the Equitable Modern Grid Initiative. But I wanted to stop here and we'll take additional questions. And really, as I flagged earlier, we're striving to provide this type of presentation to more ratepayers and organizations throughout Connecticut, because I think having those additional perspectives and viewpoints in our proceedings is hugely impactful to the ultimate decision that's made. So if you have any questions or you want the presentation replicated for your specific organization, don't hesitate to reach out. And Nathan, I will turn it back to you to address any additional questions.
Thank you, Chair. So there are a number of questions. I'm going to try to prioritize, if you will, the ones that are more high level rather than anything that's specific to a particular docket or anything like that. And obviously, if there's anything you cannot comment on, please just let us know. first question, who decides what issues or topics become dockets?
Great question. And I knew I was going to leave something out earlier, so I appreciate the question. So if you harken back to this slide I showed at the beginning with the 3 commissioners, and you may be wondering, okay, well, what's so great about being chair then, if you get an equal vote? And one of those things is that I have the ability to set the agenda for the authority. Now, there's a big caveat there, which is PURA is a creature of legislation. So if the legislature sets a priority for us, then I first. So dockets are started by a couple different ways. Legislation, so a piece of legislation can be passed and it can tell us you must initiate a docket by X date on this topic, similar to the PBR docket. A docket can also be initiated if a party, if a stakeholder petitions us. So a great example of this is, and I think we have some of those folks on the line, there's an organization in Connecticut called PACE. So they petitioned PURA about a year and a half ago to study community choice aggregation. We had the bandwidth at the time to do that, so we opened that docket at their request. So that can happen sometimes. And then a third, there's probably another way. Another way it can happen is just like a utility petitions us because they have a financing deal they need looked at or a rate case. And then the fourth bucket is the one I was talking about being chair. If there's something that I'm looking at and it's within our jurisdiction, or it might be, and I'm really interested and I think we have the bandwidth to do it, then I can direct staff to initiate a docket.
Thank you. So the next question, it's pretty short, but I actually think it's interesting as far as the implications of the answer or trying to explain it. So who is the ultimate decision maker and whether natural gas pipelines can be laid down with natural gas customers?
Okay, great question. There are a lot of different ways I could take this question. There is a pending docket at PURA right now regarding a review of the system expansion plan, which was created as a result of an earlier iteration of the comprehensive energy strategy promulgated by DEEP, and then there's some legislation that codified it. So PURA is reviewing that docket right now. Depending on whatever decision we make in that docket, PURA is a decision maker on that program, modifications to that program, et cetera. And then any decision we make could be appealed to the Superior Court. The legislature could also intervene and undo the legislation that it had. DEEP could finish their comprehensive energy strategy with different direction. And the reason I raise that is because there's a statute in Connecticut that directs PURA to be guided by the Integrated Resource Plan and Comprehensive Energy Strategy, which are documents that DEEP puts out. So there are lots of different decision makers. So it depends on if we're talking about a program or just generally speaking. But I'd say, like, whenever it comes to anything, they're broadly speaking, a decision maker. There is a decision-making authority with the legislature, with PURA, with the administration through DEEP. So it depends on what specific item, and that's the answer. It depends. Sorry.
And just to complicate matters a little bit more, if it crosses state boundaries, if it's interstate, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yes, absolutely.
So if somebody wants to follow up on understanding the legislation that either created PURA or directed PURA to do something, do you have any recommendations on how they can track down those statutes?
Yeah, so any statute that governs PURA is almost exclusively in Title 16 of the Connecticut General Statutes. I have read Title 16 from front to back. It can be done. It is not the most fun I've ever had in my life, but you could start there. Also, I think I threw up on the screen, contact information for PURA's Director of Legislation, Taryn O'Connor, and we're happy to provide any assistance that we can. There's also a body called the Office of Legislative Research, which I think that legislature can rely on to do some, background and from research into the history of specific legislation. So you can always ask your legislator for assistance. So it really depends, but all of our specific statutory authority is almost exclusively embodied in Title 16.
And of course, all of the state statutes are available at the Connecticut General Assembly too. So this next question, it's two parts. I'm actually going to ask the second part first. How can an average Connecticut person be expected to really have a chance against, say, the lawyers of Eversource or UI, or just in general, the investor-owned utilities in any type of docket?
It's a great question. I can understand and appreciate deeply why folks may be discouraged, both because the process is complicated and also because you're up against entities that employ thousands of people and are more in the weeds on this on a day-to-day basis. And what I would offer is that nothing really beats the firsthand experience that customers can convey about how something is being received. So again, I'll go back to the tropical storm investigation. We may have been receiving information from a utility in the docket saying, well, we had 50,000 outbound messages, and they're kind of overwhelming you with data at some points. But then you have even a customer on this side saying, okay, but that wasn't helpful. You sent out 50,000 of the same messages, and you told me my power was back on, so I left a hotel and I showed up and it wasn't back on. And so you can, by listening or reading testimony from an individual customer about their on-the-ground experience, it's hugely impactful, even if it's just one person. Another example would be, I sometimes review the correspondence in our vegetation management dockets, and folks will say, like, you should ask the electric utility to explain why they don't do this, and it will get me thinking about a line of inquiry that I may not have previously focused on, and then I can ask those questions of the utility in the docket or through formal discovery. So it may not always be directly transparent to you as the individual customer, especially if you can't invest the time to watch our proceedings day to day, that your voice matters, but it does. And I would like to think that there are other examples I can provide that that illustrate how we have turned individual customers' questions or testimony into a decision point.
Thank you. I do think that that's hugely important. And if anyone takes a single thing away from this presentation, I hope it's that they can actually have an impact. So the first part of that question is there any way to work with state representatives? They don't define that, but state representatives to navigate an issue that is in front of PURA?
Yes, absolutely. So if folks don't know, there's a specific committee that we most commonly appear before at the legislature. It's the Energy and Technology Committee, or ENT for short. The co-chairs, so the leadership of the committee, there Democrat, Senator Needleman, who's from Essex, and Representative Arconti from Danbury. And then there's the minority leadership is Senator Paul Formica, and Representative Charlie Ferraro. And then there's a whole host of representatives and senators that serve on that committee. So your first line of action could be to, look up whether your representative or senator is on that committee. And if not, they surely know someone that is. So there's the opportunity to, work with a member of that committee. They have public hearings on legislation. So you can go about it two ways. You can either try to effectuate change in the legislature, or you can work with that legislator to come to PURA, and they can file comments in our dockets or appear and make statements on behalf of their constituents. And many of them do. A lot showed up to the tropical storm hearing, but even more show up to, we have a poll attachment docket that, I think 5 different representatives and senators showed up to talk about. So you can work with them either at the legislature or asking them to come to PURA and kind of magnify their constituencies.
Thank you. So the next question is about the email notification system. So the question says basically, essentially, it only works with Internet Explorer. Do you have any information on how to actually make the email notification system work on other platforms?
Yeah, so that is one of the things that we're aware of. We're looking to upgrade Lotus Notes to a newer version. I'm hopeful that will happen in the first quarter, if not the second quarter of this year. That upgrade should at a minimum address the browser and what that you can use for these. I don't want to overpromise and say that the upgrade to the filing system is going to make it more searchable or easier to navigate it. I definitely don't want to overpromise, which is why I spent some time today talking about how those things are organized. But at a minimum, we expect it to address the issue with the browser.
I don't mean this as a loaded question, but is there anything in the works to update the file system at PURA?
No, that's the file system is Lotus Notes, and that's what we're attempting to upgrade. So at least this server has more capacity and can be used in different browsers. For folks that are at least tangentially aware of PURA, you may know that we tried to launch to a new, more search-friendly application about this time last year. It did not go well. So we have kind of backtracked and looked into different solutions. And the one in the short term is to upgrade the version of the file system that we have, which again, I hope will be the first quarter of this year, if not the second.
Thank you. So we did get a question for you to go into a little bit more information about the Office of Education Outreach and Enforcement. You did cover this in some detail, but if you can maybe reiterate or just talk through once again, like what it is, but how it can work for individuals.
Yep, great question. So EOE is, they have a couple of different components. The call center is incorporated into that office. So an individual customer may come into EOE through the call center, including like, do you need, like I mentioned before, do you need help with a payment arrangement? Or do you have a question or complaint about a supplier or a utility? This is less common, but hopefully more common moving forward. If you are an individual who is installing a solar array on your roof, or you need help with getting that renewable generator certified or interconnected, that may be another way that you come in through EOE because they can assist with processing those applications. Lastly, well, not lastly, but the third example I'll provide now is you may interact with EOE through a working group. So there are matters that PURA takes up that we think may be more fruitful if they are first vetted or discussed in a less formal proceeding than we have to hold. So like a working group. A great example of that recently is the system expansion plan, which again is still pending before PURA. So I'll just comment, I won't comment on it other than to say that in the first instance, we delegated that topic to EOE so that they could facilitate a working group discussion around some specific prompts that we provided. In turn, we ask EOE to summarize those discussions and to make recommendations to PURA. And it is now pending before PURA in a formal docket waiting for our decision. So you can come in through any of those different pathways or more. You can always start by emailing pura.information@ct.gov to see what the best path might be.
Thank you. And we are not going to get to all of the questions. Vegetation management is a very popular topic here. But I do have one last question, and then we will let you go. Thank you very much for your time. And to the extent you can answer this, is there any information from public, from the people that you ultimately serve, that you would be looking for? Is there any information that you would be looking for in the performance-based regulation docket from individuals?
That's a great question. So I'll answer it more broadly so I don't get myself in trouble with any specific docket. But more broadly, if you're looking to intervene or participate in a PURA proceeding and you're wondering what would be helpful for PURA, the answer is just about anything, but that can take the form of maybe you read a study or a news article on the topic, especially something that happened in another jurisdiction, and you think that PURA isn't aware of it. You're probably right. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I came from Maryland, so I have some, I have some out-of-state experience, but otherwise we tend to be very, insular. Bringing out-of-state perspectives and different ways that things are handled into the proceeding or to our attention is always helpful. So it could be pointing out studies or news articles. You could be providing specific information to how something has affected you. So, you see that Eversource has made some announcement, and how did it affect you? If you have pictures or screenshots of things, anything that could be construed as evidence on which we could base a decision. If you're looking to shape objectives or goals, whether it's in PBR or any other proceeding, because we're increasingly trying to set up objectives at the outset of our dockets, so everyone's on the same page about what we're trying to achieve. That can come in the form of, pointing to what other jurisdictions have done. It can be as simple as your own personal opinions on the matter. So it's not meant to be a high bar. But what I will say, I don't want to say that this is not helpful, but if we're defining helpful as something that evidence that we could base a decision on, simply receiving a comment that says, don't give Eversource the increase. Unfortunately, that is probably more in the bucket of not helpful, because I need to know why. That's difficult to articulate properly, because obviously, in the day and age where there's inflation, everything's so costly. You could react to my statement just now by saying, well, the answer is obvious. And my response to you is, again, we have to base our decisions on evidence in the docket. So don't just tell me that a company shouldn't get a rate increase. Tell me why. Don't just tell me that you want us to look at environmental impacts of something. Tell me why, So I think it's just the key thing here is take it the step further, and that would be more helpful.
Chair, thank you so much for joining us today. I know your time is extremely valuable, and to dedicate an hour and a half, we are very, very appreciative. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing everyone in our dockets.
Take care and have a wonderful day.